Hi everybody, welcome to my kitchen. Today I'm going to go over how to go from a winter squash to a pumpkin pie. The first step is to cut open the squash and get it roasting. You want to use a really sharp knife and be really careful of your hand that's not holding the knife because squash are not the easiest to slice. Alright, our two ends are sliced off. We're going to cut it in half. Alright, then we got our seed cavity. Squash seeds can be eaten. I usually scoop them out and roast them separately, but today I'm going to try leaving the seeds in one half and roasting them with the seeds in the squash. I like to scrape out all of the stringy stuff as much as I can with just a spoon, but I'm not too picky about it because you are going to puree everything, so if there's still a few strings in there, not a problem, they'll puree right up. Okay, and then I just put my two squash halves face down on my baking sheet. I'm going to add my scooped out seeds to roast on the side at the same time, kind of spread them out a little bit. Then we're going to throw the pan in a 450-degree oven for 45 minutes and let it roast. And while my squash is in the oven, I'm going to prep my pie crust. You can also just use a homemade pie crust. That'll have my pie crust cooling in the fridge while my squash cools down after it gets out of the oven. Alright, for the dough, we're going to mix it in a food processor. If you don't have a food processor, you can also use just a fork to mix it up, or if you have a pastry cutter, those also work great. We're going to need 1 stick of butter. I don't cut it up before I put it in the food processor, but you can. You're going to want cold butter also. Then we have 1 cup of flour. We'll do 1 tablespoon of sugar and half a teaspoon of salt. Then we're gonna process all this in our food processor, but not for very long. All right, I really just pulsed that until it was a nice powdery, not too powdery, but our butter's a little bit more broken up, but it's still kind of chunky. Then we're gonna put this in a medium bowl and mix a 1/4 cup of water, and we're gonna mix this with a fork pretty quickly. You can also just use store-bought pie crust, that's easier. Once you're not able to mix it anymore, I like to start pressing it together. And you're gonna try and press it into one ball. If it's not pressing together well, it seems maybe a little bit too dry, add a little bit more water. All right, we have it pressed into one ball. It's gonna be still a little lumpy, that's great. We want there to be large pieces of butter still in the dough. We're gonna wrap this up, stick it in the fridge for at least an hour until our squash comes out of the oven and cools to room temperature. My seeds were popping and the skin of my squash was starting to get brown, so I actually am gonna take it out of the oven a couple minutes early, about 40 minutes instead of 45. Our squash is cooled to room temperature, so we're gonna scoop it out and use a food processor to turn it into pumpkin puree. If you don't have a food processor, your squash should be soft enough to just smash it with a fork, or you could use that pastry cutter that you use for your pie crust, or something like a potato masher, anything to get it into a puree. You can also use a blender. All right, this is the half that I took the seeds out of, so this will be really nice and easy to just scoop all that soft flesh into my food processor. All right, then this is the half that I left the seeds in. Scoop those out. It is definitely easier to scoop out cooked seeds. All right, we have all of our squash scooped into our food processor, and we'll process until smooth. That's it. From here, we're gonna measure out 2 cups of pumpkin puree for our pie. All right, I have my 2 cups of pumpkin puree in a bowl. I'm gonna add the rest of my pie filling ingredients. I like to mix up my pie filling before I roll out my pie crust, just so that it can settle a little bit, get any bubbles out before we pour it into the pan. All right, I have 2 cups pumpkin puree. I'm gonna add 1/3 cup of brown sugar and 1/3 cup of white sugar. If you just have one, just double the one. 3 eggs. And we're gonna beat those good before we add into our pumpkin mixture. All right, we have a spice blend. I have some cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, a little bit of salt, all mixed up together so that it's nice and evenly distributed. We'll add that in. And then finally, we need 1.5 cups of heavy cream. And then we're just gonna whisk everything together really well. All right, our final product is gonna look really nice and smooth. It has this beautiful orange color. I really love using red kabocha squash because it's so vibrant. So it's nice and smooth. A little bit of bubbles will pop up as it rests while we roll out our dough. All right, we have our chilled dough. I have it on top of a piece of saran wrap that it has a little bit of water underneath it on a counter to help it stick. All right, we'll measure with our pie plate, see that it goes all the way around the circumference, looks good. So we'll peel it up with our saran wrap. and flip it over into our pan. And then you can just peel the saran wrap right off and you have a nice pie crust right in your pan. All right, I'm not too finicky with my pie crust. If you want to do something fancy around the edges, go for it. I like to just trim it up so it's nice and even around the edge. At this point, I've preheated my oven. We're getting ready to bake momentarily. And always leave your crust a little bit higher up than you think because it will shrink. Then we just add the pie filling. I like to give it one more slow stir just to make sure that nothing's settled at the bottom. Depending on the size of your pie plate, it might be really full. Then we're gonna carefully put this in the oven. It's liquidy, so it will slosh around a little bit. We're gonna bake for about 45 minutes. My preheated oven is at 425. After 15 minutes, I'm going to turn it down to 350. At 45 minutes, I'm gonna do a toothpick test to see if it's goopy inside. You can also just wiggle it a little bit and see if it's liquidy or really set up. If it's super firm, we'll pull it out of the oven. Otherwise, we'll let it go for another 5 minutes and check every 5 minutes. All right, our timer went off. I checked it at 45 minutes. It wasn't quite done. It was still pretty runny in the middle. I put foil on it halfway through. I took it off after 45 minutes just so the center could cook a little bit more. I think I had this in for an hour total. It's still a little bit jiggly, but it's not, it's more like jello and not like water anymore. You'll want to let this cool before you enjoy, but that's how you turn a squash into a pumpkin pie.